Welcome, everyone, my students, as well as any guests who are here. If there are, I know there are guests, I can already see some of the names, but if you're a guest, please feel welcome to share your name and maybe where you're from in the chat box so that we can all get a sense of who's joining us today. I'm going to share a little bit in my language, just as an introduction. Bonjour, greetings. Makomasen de go. The spirit calls me Bear Walker. Nindwe Mogini Dug. I am related to everything. Mishikan Dam. I am Turtle Clan. Dishkanzi being in Dunjaba, I was born and raised along the Horn of the Serpent River, or present-day London, Ontario. Anishinaabe Ojibwe and Indian Dao. I'm an Anishinaabe Ojibwe man, and I'm also Irish, so quite a mix. I call myself a hybrid. I don't know if anybody else calls me that, but anyways, yeah, I'm really excited to share today. Today's topic is the Anthropocene. Even in that little introduction that I did, I said a number of words in my language and their meaning is extensive. Some people think that bonjour is a reference to bonjour, but it's not. Bonjour is a reference to one of our original teachers. We usually only say the name of that being, that Manidug, that spirit, when there's snow on the ground. I'm going to make an exception in this case, just so you get a sense of the full name of that one. It's Wena Boju, and I just ask for forgiveness for that spirit for bringing up that name out of season. That one showed us many things as people, showed us how to be humans. And so when we say that bonjour, when we say that greeting, which is a translation to English, what we're really saying, what I'm saying to you is, I see in you, I recognize in you the spirit of that original being, that original human. And so it's more than a greeting, it's a recognition of our connection as humans. When I say my spirit name, or the name that the spirit gave me, it literally gave me that name, Mokomase. In fact, it gave me that name in English, but I went out to fast. I went out to the land. This was over a decade ago. And I went without food or water for a few days, a couple of days. And I literally asked the spirit, this was my intention, for my name. And of course, when I came out of that fast that night, I had this really epic dream in which at the end of the dream, this voice came in front of my face, this energy, this entity, and said, "Your name is Bear Walker," in a very commanding voice. When we say, Mokomase Indigo, what we're saying is that, what I'm saying is that there's a name that the spirit gives us. And that connects us to a place. It connects us to our gifts as people. And so there's a lot of things about that Manidug, that spirit, that I was to take responsibility for. And there's just so much I can't really go into it at this time, because I do want to focus on our topic of discussion today. When we say Nindawe Maginidug, like, what I'm saying is I am literally related to all the things, everything. I'm related to you. I'm related to the earth. I'm related to all the trees, the water, the skies. I'm related to all the planets in the whole universe. That's literally what you're saying. And so as you grow in this knowledge, which for many is a challenge because of the extent of colonialism. And what we see with the rise of colonialism is the fall of the environment. And that really is what today's topic is about, the Anthropocene, which is pronounced in multiple ways. So as mankind takes dominion, so to speak, over other beings, the result is those other beings decline. It's really quite simple. And so that is where we're at right now. That is why this is a topic in this course. And I'm going to show you a video in a moment, but it's the reason, part of the reason why I live, part of the reason why I believe I came to this earth now at this time, to serve in this purpose, which is to remind people what it means to be a human. Everything that I talk about in this course, some of you are guests, and welcome again to all those who are guests here today. Thank you for joining us. This is a class, Arch 285, and I forget the environment. I forget the number. Maybe May, you could find that out, put in the chat box. But it's cross-listed with the School of Architecture and the School of Environment. And the long title is Indigenous Land Sustainability Practices in the Carolinian Zone, Knowledge for a Changing Climate. And so you're coming into this class as a guest today. We're turning the corner on midway through the course. So there's been much that has been discussed prior to this moment. And when we get to this discussion topic of the Anthropocene, it's really within a context. It's in a context of students learning the truth, or as much of the truth as we can offer given the circumstances of our history about Indigenous people, and particularly three groups of Indigenous peoples in southwestern Ontario, and that is the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Chinatan, or the Attawandaron. These are groups that didn't just appear, 13,000 years ago after crossing a land bridge as science, or like, the story goes according to the colonizer. That's simply false. Not only did we arrive here 13,000 years ago, but we were here for much, much longer. And, it's unfortunate that much of what I speak about, it's not found in a lot of history texts or anthropological texts or archaeological texts, but it is embedded in our stories, and our stories are ancient. And in fact, our stories go back to the very beginning of time, which for some who have been embedded into colonialism, entrenched in some of the lies that have been told, that is very hard to believe. I choose to believe that story because I trust that the elders who have taught me, the ancestors who have guided me towards those teachings for a reason. I think no more important is that reason now than at any other time in the history of humanity. So I remind my students regularly, and I continue to, some of what I share today, some of what I share each class, you may only hear once in a lifetime. And so rather than trying to interpret everything I say, or I was really glad that one of my students this week, and her reflection, she basically admitted that she wants to, I'm not going to say who this is out of respect, but Googling a lot of what I say. And it's not the first encounter I've had with students who essentially want to prove me wrong. I think this is one of the few contexts, being an Indigenous scholar in scholarship, that students in their early years of learning want nothing more than to believe that everything I'm saying is either untrue or made up. But that's okay. It's okay that that is the case. I've faced it for my entire 10-year teaching career. I continue to face it in the colonial institutions that I serve, and I will until such time that people realize that what I'm saying is actually true. And if we don't act upon these things, that it's not just me saying that, it's not just Indigenous leaders who have been saying it for hundreds of years. It's scientists all around the world, if that gives it more credence. It's people who realize what is happening right now and the threat that we are facing. So I do want to just say to my students, thank you for your reflections. I got through my portion of them yesterday. For the vast majority of you, I'm just blown away by the introspection that's happening, the seeing inward, and the growth. Thank you. Thank you for trusting that this is a doorway to your own heart. And that in that heart lies the secrets of the entire universe, with each beat, Ode, Ode, Ode. To those still struggling with these teachings, and I would say struggling with the delivery of these teachings in the format that I use, that's okay. I was there once too. I did not grow up with these teachings. I did not, I was not surrounded by my elders as I should have been. I was not born with the sound of the drum in a lodge, surrounded by my aunties and uncles and grandparents and family members singing me into this world. I was not born that way. And so I too had to struggle with forgetting everything that I thought I knew. And I still hold misconceptions based on colonialism. And I have to forgive myself for that every day, right? I have to forgive myself and say that it's okay. For those of you who really don't want to enter into like this sphere of wisdom that I am attempting to share, and it's not mine. None of it belongs to me. It belongs to our ancestors. It belongs to our elders. It belongs to this land, this earth, this one earth that we have, this one chance that we have to, make a difference. That's okay. I realize that in the thousands of students that I've taught, the thousands of students who have taught me, there's always some who at the end will still believe that image of the primitive Indian, the one depicted marauding around in the forest, wearing a loincloth and carrying a spear and waiting to kill the next thing that walks by. I just want to remind you that nothing could be further from the truth. But I'm not here to change anybody. I'm only here to offer a perspective, and one that I have had to painstakingly seek. Right? Being an Indigenous man in this country at this time does not give me some kind of one up in terms of our communities. Remember that there has been a coordinated, strategic, and deliberate attempt to annihilate us on this planet and all the knowledge that we built over the course of thousands of generations. And so, again, thank you all for joining us. I share that much as an introduction, to set the tone for more. But before I go into what I want to talk about in terms of the Anthropocene today, I know that there are two students who just want to share a little bit about their experience. I invited the students to share based on their experience so far, whether that be positive or negative. And I can't remember exactly who that was, but maybe those people can put themselves forward in this moment.
I just wanted to say that before coming to the School of Architecture, I was always someone who felt very connected to place, and had a sort of, I loved being outside and having that connection to the outdoors. And I feel like that was sort of lost throughout my education, just in the sense of like moving around for.
Okay, I think we lost Emma. Who is the other person? Was it Nick? Oh, or Sarah, we lost you for a second there.
I'll be brief. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Andrew. I think this course has really helped me rekindle my connection to the land and sort of re-understand it in a different way, and being able to sit on the land and reflect and journal, and has been a really beautiful thing to be brought back into my life. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. And yeah, it's great that you're contributing. Who was the other person? Was it Nick? I can't remember.
It wasn't me, but I can speak nonetheless.
Okay, go ahead.
So far, I'm really really enjoying the course, and not just in the teachings that we're learning, but in the sense of community that the course is fostering. And I think that ties into the kinds of teachings that you're bringing up, which are much less instructor-student and much more familial. And I personally I've realized that I've learned some of the strongest lessons when I've been sharing them with other people in the group discussions and in my reflections. And I really appreciate your emphasis on making what we're learning in this course personal, as opposed to just trying to satisfy an academic requirement. And so thank you very much. And like I mentioned at the beginning of today's lecture, the principle of Mino Bimatisuen has really been on my mind and in my heart, in the sense that everything that I'm doing this semester in my studio and in my other courses, I'm challenging myself to think, how do I actually apply this? How do I actually do this so that it goes beyond just knowledge and becomes action?
Thank you, Nick. That's a excellent, segue to starting today's content. That's exactly what I ask. And it's a great reminder for me, because I wanted to say this one last thing before we jump in, that it is evident that there are many students who have made that transition through the reflections. I came to witness that you realize the agency you have as a person, that you're not sort of like floating on the wind and wherever it might take you, but your agency can and does make a difference when you take action based on the things that you're learning. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for all those who identified some of the ways that they have and are taking action based on some of the learning in this course, and just based on their own will to want to take part in the change that is happening on this planet right now. For anybody who's here, I just want to say that if at any time you have a question, a comment, I may not see it right away, but don't feel that you can't interrupt or jump in or say something. This is a welcoming space. I may challenge you, or you may challenge me, and that's okay. I often come at things from a very different perspective than those that I encounter, but it doesn't make me right and you wrong, or you right and me wrong. As my teacher always says, there's always 7 ways to view everything. And it's up to us as humans to embody those 7 perspectives. So with that, this image is one of my favorite. This is about 2 weeks before my dog passed last year. A couple of days ago marked the 1-year anniversary. It was actually through this first iteration of this course that Chimera, my best friend of 12 years, succumbed to cancer. But even up to the very last day, she was strong, she was well, but her limbs were so swollen she could barely breathe. But she was an incredible friend, incredible dog. She walked with me without a leash everywhere I went, and it was through my whole education journey. I think I got her in my 2nd year or 3rd year possibly, but she would come to university with me and walk the halls, and without a leash, she was quite an amazing dog. So that's a tribute to her and the 1-year anniversary of her passing. But what is the Anthropocene? Okay, well, I'm going to go through that in detail, and I've also included a few different support mechanisms like videos, one from one of the greatest thinkers of our time, Noam Chomsky. But consider that as colonization took hold on Turtle Island and an entirely new epoch began, the Anthropocene. Lewis and Maslin write, human activity will probably be observable in the geological stratigraphic record for millions of years into the future, which suggests a new epoch has begun. Okay. Now, an epoch is supposed to take millions of years, okay? That's historically. So there's a lot of debate about the Anthropocene and what it means and how it can be measured. And there's a lot of precedent setting things that are happening right now that they just have never happened before. And sadly, there is still denial. There's this denialist agenda of what is happening on our earth or what is caused by, and unfortunately, there's not much we can do because sometimes those with that denialist agenda are in positions of power. But I just included this picture of a giant oak, and you can see that's me sitting on this oak. It is at a golf course. One of the things that my grandfather, John Smith, that's his actual name, taught me. He was an Englishman, so I'm English as well. But yeah, he taught me how to golf, and so I go once in a while. But it's incredible the size of an oak, and at its peak, this would be an ancient oak here, probably a couple hundred years old, perhaps just after the controlled burns had stopped. This tree had been either planted or was already growing. So not much evidence of the scarification on its northwest edge, but still just gives you a sense of what the Carolinian forest, the oak savanna might have looked like, with a few trees, spaced about every 80 feet. So I do want to play this video for you. These are words that, I can't say as well as this man who's been fighting for the rights of Indigenous peoples for longer than I've been alive. So these are the words of Noam Chomsky on the Anthropocene.
Since 1945, we have been somehow surviving the nuclear age, actually miraculously, and we can't count on miracles going on forever. But we didn't know in 1945 was that humans were entering into another epoch, a new one, which is no less ominous. It's what geologists call the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch in which human activity is destroying the environment. There have been debates among scientists about when to date the onset of the Anthropocene. But last year, the World Geological Society determined that a proper time to set it is right after World War II, the same time as the nuclear age. And the reason is because of the sharp escalation at that point in human activities, which were significantly damaging and will soon destroy the environment for organized life. We might add that the Anthropocene carries with it automatically a third major epoch, which is called the Sixth Extinction. You look through millions of years of history, there have been periods when some event caused a mass extinction of animal life. And the last one was 65,000 years ago, when an asteroid hit the Earth, destroyed about 75% of animal life, ended the age of the dinosaurs, actually opened a way for small mammals to survive. They ultimately became us. We are determined to become another asteroid intent on destroying most animal life on Earth, and we're well advanced in that process. So there are three major epochs that we've been living with: the nuclear age, the Anthropocene, Sixth Extinction, all accelerating. So let's just ask, how dangerous is the Anthropocene? Well, I'll give you a couple of recent illustrations from some of the leading scientific journals, recent articles. So I'll start with Nature, British journal, the leading general scientific article. The title of the article is Global Warming's Worst Case Projections Look Increasingly Likely. Now, reading it, a new study based on satellite observations finds that temperatures could rise nearly 5 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. The odds that temperatures will increase more than 4 degrees by that 2100 in the current scenario increased from 62% to 93%. In other words, pretty near certain. You go back to the Paris agreements, Paris negotiations, December 2015. The hope was in the international negotiations that the temperature rise could be kept to 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. And they considered that maybe 2% would be tolerable. Instead, we're heading to 4 to 5% with very high confidence. And here's one from the World Meteorological Organization. recent one. Concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere surged at a record-breaking speed in 2016, last figures they have, to the highest level in 800,000 years. The abrupt changes in atmosphere witnessed in the past 70 years, the Anthropocene, are without precedent in the geological record. Globally, average concentrations of CO2 reached over 400 parts per million, up from just 400 parts per million in 2015, which has been considered the upper tolerable limit, so we're now beyond it. The concentrations of CO2 are now 150% above the pre-industrial level. The rapidly increasing atmospheric levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases have the potential to initiate unprecedented changes in climate systems, leading to severe ecological and economic destructions. The last time the Earth experienced a comparable concentration of CO2 was somewhere around 3 to 5 million years ago. At that point, the temperature was 2 to 3 degrees centigrade above now, and the sea level was 30 to 60 feet higher than it is now. That's what we're moving to in the near future. In fact, we're going beyond, because the prediction is to 4 to 5 degrees centigrade. Well, I'll leave the effects to your imagination. Here's a final example, journal Science, one of the leading American science journals. Even slightly warmer temperatures, less than anticipated in coming years, could start melting permafrost, which in turn threatens to trigger the release of huge amounts of greenhouse gases trapped in ice. There's twice as much carbon in permafrost as in the atmosphere. This will release huge amounts of methane, which actually is far more lethal than CO2, even though shorter persistence. And that accelerates other processes now very clearly underway, like the rapid melting of polar ice. And polar ice, as it melts, it reduces the reflective surface for sun's rays and creates more absorbent surfaces, the dark seas. So that accelerates warming. Could lead to a nonlinear process in which everything blows up. It's leading, among other things, to the breaking up and the melting of huge Antarctic ice caps. One of them, West Antarctica, contains enough ice to raise sea level more than 10 feet. We're pretty easy to continue. In brief, the prospects are extremely serious. In fact, they're really awesome, which raises an obvious question. What are we doing about it? How are we reacting? Well, the world is actually taking some steps, inadequate, but at least something. There's a commitment. And states and localities in the United States are also taking steps, which is quite important. But what is of prime importance, of course, is the federal government, the most powerful institution in human history. So what is it doing? It's withdrawn from the international efforts, but beyond that, it's committed to increasing the use of the most destructive fossil fuels. So our federal government, for which we are responsible, is dramatically leading a race to destruction while we sit and watch. That's pretty astounding. Now, that ought to be the screaming headline in every day's newspaper.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. I agree. That really should be the screaming headline. I wanted to, when I was listening to Noam talk about this, and keep in mind, this was 3 years ago that he spoke on this topic. This was before the pandemic. Before we entered this real age of crisis that we continue to be in at this moment. I remember I was sitting in a meeting at the school. I used to work at Conestoga College, and it was like a board, like all the upper echelon of the university, and I for whatever reason was on that board, and I brought up a conversation about climate change and how we were addressing it as a community. And I remember that the president, and I really appreciate him. He's quite a man. He didn't hear me, and I said, how are we addressing climate change as a school? And they were taking some action, as some are, but it just then, all of a sudden, the skies got dark. And so we were sitting in this glass office, literally surrounded by glass windows all the way around, save for one side. And it started to rain really hard. And all of a sudden it started to lightning and thunder. Like it was insane. Like the wind just came in and blew everything away. And I remember thinking, is anybody else seeing this? Like nobody said anything about this epic storm that was just like came in an instant and really left in an instant as well. But that is and will continue to be our new reality, our collective reality. The storms that will continue to affect us and impact us are going to grow on an epic scale, one that is almost unimaginable at this point. We're seeing it happen in various places around the world, and it really only is a matter of time until a storm that takes our homes out, that takes our systems that we rely on out, hits. So if ever there were a time to prepare for what is going on in our world right now, that time is now. That time has passed. Action has to be taken. Okay. So let's come back though. Let's come back to the Anthropocene. What is it? Like, what's happening? How do we sort of define it? And in the Lewis and Maslin article that was posted for the students today, they recognize these sort of four parts to the Anthropocene, right? So this geologically important human-induced environmental impact, okay? And there are still people who want to debate whether or not this is human-induced, but I just challenge you to go outside and look around, wherever it is you are, whether you're living in a farm, okay, and more than likely, there's something like a 95% possibility, if that is the kind of environment that you find yourself surrounded with at this time, it looks not at all like the kind of polyculture practices that were, what's the word I'm looking for, that were prolific prior to the time of colonization. Likely, if you find yourself in a farm field, there's going to be machinery. There's going to be one kind of crop, more than likely corn, and that corn probably isn't even for people. So additionally, that corn, the seed for it was purchased from a multinational corporation which holds a patent on it, which you cannot regrow. So the corn in farm fields like those owned by Monsanto and Bayer, it's now Bayer, but you cannot take a seed off that corn cob, put it back in the earth in the coming year and grow a corn stalk. They have genetically altered them to not produce or reproduce. So each year, farmers have to buy the seed. So that's very foreign to the ancestors of this land, where the sacredness of the corn seed was essential to life. So second, we're reviewing the history of the naming of the epoch that modern human societies live within, to provide insights into contemporary Anthropocene related debates. So this is really a new epoch. Like this, our impact on the earth as humans, not some mysterious force that possibly could be the reason. It's us. And it's as a result, in part, of the mentality that has spread very much like a virus across the world. Okay. It is something that is completely foreign to the indigenous thought that I've been exposed to over the past 15 years. There's no reflection of it. In fact, there's the only comparison that I can make to the way that we currently live was there's this spirit in our teachings, and we often don't say the name. I'm going to make an exception yet again in this instance and ask for forgiveness from that Manidug, from that spirit, that I'm not calling on it to be present, but I'm simply acknowledging that it is there, and that is the Wintigo. And essentially the Wintigo is this cannibalistic monster that has an insatiable appetite that can never be satisfied. And we referred to it in our stories, that it came from time to time into our communities and took over the minds and the hearts of some of our peoples, and that it had to be combated, through various means. And I believe that now we are facing that same spirit, and sadly, the teachings on how to defeat that being have mostly not been shared. So the environmental changes caused by human activity that may have left global geological markers consistent with formal criteria that define a geological epochs. Our impact on the land, we're going to see, in several million years. If, let's say, there's still archaeologists and that's still a thing, and they still dig up our bones, and they're going to find some of the most diseased people who ever lived. They're going to find that our way of life in the rise of urbanism, the rise of capitalism, essentially choked the very breath of life from our air. And if there are still humans remaining there, they might question why. And I sometimes think about that moment. Right? It's similar to the moment that archaeologists today will dig up our ancestral bones, the ones, let's say, found in southwestern Ontario, and find that they were actually some of the healthiest bones to ever be discovered in the world. And they'll see this layer of some of the healthiest people to ever have lived. Perhaps draw conclusions about their way of life, and then they'll see this other layer of essentially garbage that takes millions of years to dissolve. Maybe it'll be the next power source. Who knows? Like the dinosaurs are for us today, but they might just question, what were we thinking? What could possibly have led us down this path? And while I'm not going to go into a debate about that in this moment, I often question that myself. What have we done? And how are we ever going to recover from the mess that we have created? And of course, I take action on this, but we'll get into that in a moment. So finally, we highlight the advantages and disadvantages of the few global markers that indicate a date to define the beginning of the Anthropocene. And I do want to, in some ways, challenge the mark that Noam and some of his colleagues have set as the date of the beginning of the Anthropocene. And I'll get into that in a moment, because when you look through an indigenous lens at the age of man, what we see is that really began when one of our first treaties was violated. And that was a treaty with the fish. So something that, in my education personally throughout all the years that I went, there was never a conversation about the human relationship to the fish. It was more like, how do we catch them? How do we consume them? But if you go back to the year 500, when, for example, in Canada, we have Cartier, this great hero, for us, a great villain, Jacques Cartier, entering into the eastern waters of our eastern seaboard. What we see is the decimation, the utter decimation of fish populations, near to the point of extinction. Now, if we take just that as an example of the start of the age of man, you can't really look at the decimation of the population of fish out of context when you're viewing this from an indigenous lens. We had an agreement with the fish because, remember, Nindawe Malginidug, I am related to everything. As a human being, all those other ones are my relations, according to the way we see the world as an Anishinaabe people. Well, you decimate the fish populations, there's a cascading effect in the nutrients that find their ways way into the river systems that line the entirety of Canada. So now our trees along those riverbeds aren't getting the same nutritional value. And when the trees don't grow at their same rates or get the nutrition they need to kind of produce the sustenance, all of a sudden there's like this huge cascading effect. And I'm just talking about the trees as just one example of the impacts. But for example, just on the oak tree alone, there's, I think, I forget the exact number, but it's something like 500 different bug species. And I may be exaggerating that number slightly. But then you have just those bug species, only certain birds will eat those certain bugs. And so you see the decline in that. At this time, schools of fish could number in the millions, perhaps billions. And there are stories that I've heard where we could literally cross the backs of the fish during certain spawning seasons, just due to the utter numbers that they had. And now I want you to put that in relationship, because there's a relationship in our cosmology between the ones that are underwater and the ones that fly. This is a ancient relationship and carved into stone throughout our territories. That is a relationship between the Miji-Biji or Miju-Biju, depending on pronunciation. Of course, there are approximately 35 to 100 dialects of the Algic language alone, of which Anishinaabe is a part. And that is known as maybe the underwater serpent or the underwater lynx. That's the horned serpent, which I referred to in my introduction, of which I grew along that river, and has played an extraordinary role in my life in leading me to certain elders and teachers, as well as places that still carry the spirit of that Maniduke, that being, that one that we recognize as playing an integral role in the relationship to all the fish, all the underwater beings, and the Nimikibanesi, or that thunderbird. Interestingly, I work for a school now that symbol is the thunderbird, Algoma University. They're doing their best to work within the confines of a colonialist agenda. But, how bad is it? What is really going on? Well, if we just look at the numbers, we have released humans, not some random set of circumstances, humans have released approximately 555 petagrams of carbon, and one petagram is 1 billion metric tons. Now, I know that statistic is slightly out of date. And if we look at just 1750, and keep in mind 1750 is 250 years after Cartier arrived to the East Coast and decimated the fish populations, that period of time is often left out of any kind of historical record, especially in our neoliberal education system, because it's essentially the time that Indigenous people, despite the decline in population they experienced between 1500 and 1600, continue to thrive. There's a reason why Canada is not a conquered country. And a lot of people don't realize that. Often the story that I heard and even told until I was educated on the topic was that, Europeans arrived, they took over, and then, Canada became a country. And that's sort of how the story goes. But think of it this way, 1750 till present day is also 250 years. And think of all that has happened in that time. So, we're looking at an incredible series of events that happen prior to what I would consider closer to the age of man. In fact, I think we have to go back even further if we're going to set a date through an Indigenous lens. But we have not seen these kind of carbon emissions in our atmosphere for 800,000 years, possibly several million. We have delayed the next glaciation event, and our ocean acidity rates are extraordinarily high. And what is the impact of that? Well, I'm just going to show you this short video. I don't know how much I'll show, but to give you a sense of what it means when the oceans become acid.
The ocean keeps secrets. Hidden beneath its waves are worlds within worlds. Over billions of years, the ocean has created endless varieties of life. Life that enchants us, that sustains us. And despite our science, life that mystifies us still.
The oceans are an incredible place, full of the most amazing kinds of life. Life that you could never imagine really working. Things that if somebody just thought of them and showed them to you, you'd think, that's ridiculous. Nothing like that could ever live. But it does.
In 35 years of diving, it's quite a picture. I've spent my life on the bottom of the ocean with black sea bass, I've seen white sharks underwater. I've been in schools of bait that would be so big that they will dark out the sun. I can only hope that the ocean maintains that vitality. It's an incredible place of mystery, and it's something that's beautiful beyond description.
People rely on the oceans in so many ways. Some ways are obvious, like food, recreation, transportation.
They clean our shores. They protect our coastlines from storms.
The oceans regulate climate and provide the world with most of its oxygen.
But we are now certain of one awesome fact. The ocean's power to create life is rivaled by our own power to destroy it. Scientists refer to ocean acidification as the other carbon problem. The first, of course, is global warming.
People have heard about global warming for years, but it's only over the past 5 years that experts really understood that the carbon dioxide is causing a problem for the oceans as well. And what's worrisome is it hasn't even been on our radar.
Carbon dioxide pollution is transforming the chemistry of the ocean, rapidly making the water more acidic. In decades, rising ocean acidity may challenge life on a scale that has not occurred for tens of millions of years. So we confront an urgent choice: to move beyond fossil fuels, or to risk turning the ocean into a sea of weeds.
When we burn coal, oil, or gas, we introduce carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the atmosphere touches the ocean over 70% of Earth's surface. So this carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere, we are also putting into the ocean.
Carbon dioxide, or CO2, exists naturally in our atmosphere. Plants need it to grow. Animals exhale it in every breath. But carbon dioxide is also a byproduct of burning fossil fuels. And in large amounts, it is a dangerous pollutant. Since the Industrial Revolution, the ocean has absorbed roughly 1/4 of the carbon dioxide produced by burning fuels. Scientists once thought this beneficial. After all, that carbon dioxide would otherwise accelerate global warming. But what happens when so much carbon dioxide, 22 million tons of it each day, mixes with ocean water? In terms of chemistry, the answer is simple. It becomes an acid.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. There's much more to that video, and I do encourage you to check it out. Before I go on, I just wanted to take a moment to perhaps invite some feedback. I do this sometimes, but is there anybody who has any comments based on anything that they've encountered so far? Alexandra, go ahead.
Jump in and say, yeah, like something I've been trying to like grapple with lately is like, I guess a new sense of like anger that I've started to have, like seeing all these different things. Like at first it made me sad to like see the earth go down in this spiral, and now kind of seeing just like how much like things have changed, and that kind of like that we've let it get to this point, and that we need to like kind of establish this Anthropocene I guess epoch sort of in a way that just shows like how like much decimation has come to like the environment and stuff, like through like a lack of like I guess connecting with the earth on a personal level is just like becoming really angering, like why didn't we do it sooner, sort of. So like I think kind of something I'm trying to like grapple with right now is like how to balance these new feelings that I have to actually drive change and not just like get mad at like big corporations and stuff like that. So yeah, just kind of trying to change that anger into like a motivating drive for change in our society. So
That's awesome, Alex. Yeah, that's a big transition that one has to make. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be angry about. And one of the things I always taught is like to transmute that anger into action but remember, based on what's here, right? That I can't be responsible for anybody else. I can only take action based on what's in my own heart, and the knowledge that I have. So I appreciate you sharing that, your truth, and I hope that, that anger does inspire, action, and realizing that you do have agency as a person on this planet. So thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to maybe share a comment? These are those, especially in this class. Oh, Brenda, go ahead.
Hi, also thank you for opening this up to guests today. But I was just thinking, especially on that note of anger, that sometimes for me, I think you can get very angry about something, and then that anger can sort of turn to more of a depression and a sadness and a sort of like, this is what it is. And that can be also a hard place to feel any hope for, the future. And I think that this, with what you have just shared, has made me remember how dire it is, and that maybe I've been in a place where I've just sort of been, I guess in a ways, we can relate this to sort of COVID and just like dealing with this sort of as like a thing that we're in. But just remembering that I need to sort of think a little bit more about that and maybe move out of this space. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Brenda, for that comment. And yeah, certainly I can relate to, this yet a new crisis, right? I mean, as an Indigenous person, we're facing like so many fronts of crisis. It's kind of unbelievable that we even still like are here. But yeah, certainly it is easy to become complacent, especially, in Canada, where these things are not sort of impacting us. The immediate impact isn't quite felt, but what Noam is saying, right? If you believe, one of the greatest minds of our modern era, what he's saying, he's talking about like 30 to 60 feet of oceanic rise, and he's not the only one. He's not just making that up. These are projections based on the acceleration of CO2 emissions, as well as what's the other one, the methane emissions, which is worse. But I'm not afraid, and Sarah, you go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna sort of say something on a similar vein that you were going on, Andrew. And I think the thing that I get frustrated by is that the people or the individuals or the corporations, whatever, who have the most influence and power to change are the ones who aren't directly impacted for the most part by the consequences of like our actions and their actions. And so it's like frustrating to sometimes understand how powerful change can happen. And I think like the pandemic was interesting because like we were able to see how on a global scale people in power can make quick decisions in order to sort of moderate and like try to lessen the spread of the pandemic. But it's frustrating for me because they're not moving with the same urgency when it comes to sort of the climate crisis. And I think it is because, like, again, people, the individuals, the corporations who are really contributing to its acceleration and its exponential acceleration are the ones who aren't being impacted by its, like, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's funny, you just reminded me when I woke up this morning, I was thinking about this conversation today, this talk, and just one moment, Emma will get to you. And I had this thought about what to share, but it actually came from a place of frustration and anger. And that's really not the way that I've been taught to share messages. It's like you get more bees with honey than vinegar or something like that. I forget the saying how it goes, but for example, like our communities are still something like 80 communities without clean running water. And the cost is nominal in comparison to what has been afforded from the land that has been stolen, which is a whole other conversation, not today, but then we have this global pandemic and we see $250 billion just there it goes, which is just incredible. Like, it's just incredible when sometimes 10 million could ensure community free, clean running water. But of course, those are Indigenous communities, which are treated quite differently than the rest of society, which is a whole other topic. We've talked about it before. I do want to focus on the Anthropocene today, but one last comment from Emma, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to what Sarah was saying, because it made me start thinking about how when people like me, or when people, I hope like the rest of us, get into those places where we can start to make change, and like these like government organizations or committees or whatever, and for me at least, have a very specific like main issue of the environment that we want to talk about. We get into those places and then we realize, or at least I've realized, that it's very difficult to make change as an outsider. And it's also very difficult to find the key point where you actually have power. I've spent a lot of time in education advocacy, and you, as a student, you have a very specific area that you're allowed to be in. And you can get on other committees and you can sit in other groups, but they're very difficult to access. And all the decision-making is actually done in those very private areas. And this isn't to talk poorly about the groups that I sit on and work with, but a lot of the time when it comes to the point where I actually have the power to say something or say my opinion, or bring up a point that one of my peers have made to me about the environment or the way that students are treated, the decisions have already been made and I'm just saying something for the sake of saying it, and the vote will pass regardless. And so I find it very frustrating when we get into these discussions about how we can make change in the government, because at that point where you want to make change in the government, you somehow have to sit on every single committee to be able to make a decision that is valuable. And I don't really have a solution to that. It's just another issue to pile on to why can governments make decisions with COVID so quickly, but they can't do the same for the environment. They can't do the same for Indigenous people.
Thank you, Emma. That's poignant, and I certainly can relate to that experience. I did want to just read a portion of my dissertation that I produced. So where is this? So as mentioned in chapter 2, neoliberal practices have led to extraordinary levels of consumerism, corruption, and greed, which Gosh entitles the great derangement of our society, resulting in poverty, pollution, and pestilence at global proportions. In his book of the same title, Gosh writes, "We have entered, as Timothy Morton says, the age of hyperobjects, which are defined in part by the stickiness, their ever-present firmer adherence to our lives. Even to speak of the weather, the safest of subjects, is now to risk a quarrel with a denialist neighbor. It is clear that if we do not immediately dialogue around these issues, we may have little time left to overcome the change or change the extermination of biodiversity of life on Earth. And this should not be just an Indigenous people's issue." So I wrote that several years ago, and it kind of continues to stay true. You know, the book with the title "The Great Derangement" kind of speaks to this place that in most of the conversations, and I just want to say thanks that University of Waterloo, you know, not only did they recently announce a climate emergency, which is pretty epic in my opinion, but they're also allowing me the space to teach this course and share some of this. So I do feel grateful that, you know, my voice, at least to some extent, is being heard. And it's not just my voice, it's you know, the voice of many who have come before me. So let's continue, you know, in talking about what the Anthropocene is, and, you know, how it continues to impact us and how it will continue to impact us on, you know, a scale that is somewhat unimaginable, certainly unimaginable to the indigenous mind, perhaps more accepted amongst the colonial thought. So defining the Anthropocene presents a further challenge, right? You know, our Earth systems are not just instantaneous. And I think that's part of the reason why, you know, taking action today, people are slow to take action. You know, when I started to realize some of these things, you know, I wanted to build foodscapes. I wanted to restore land. I wanted to realize the, you know, the great wisdom of my ancestors and what I had learned. And quickly I realized that that can't be done alone. You know, I often remind students in this class, as well as the others that I teach, that when we think of indigenous knowledge, it's often isolated as sort of this thing that existed in the past that was primitive, that really can have no impact on our present day society. And that's more of a reflection of where that person who believes that is than it is about the knowledge that we're referring to. And in fact, I actually believe we've been through events like this, global warming, you know, catastrophic environmental circumstances in which we ended up surviving and thriving as a result of the lessons we learned. So because it's not instantaneous, you know, because you can't just turn on your TV and see the sea level rise, I think that people often think, well, it's somebody else's problem. But the truth is, and, you know, similar to what was just said, you know, this is impacting people all around the world right now. You know, there's something like 30 million climate refugees currently annually. 30 million, right? So it kind of puts the pandemic into perspective when you consider that, you know, 30 million people, something like that, every year are fleeing climate change. And it's not just the fleeing of climate change as if, you know, a great storm is coming and we all have to run away. It's the wars that result when, you know, water levels decline. It's the impacts of, you know, crops being decimated by bugs on a proportion that is truly unimaginable to most people until you actually experience it with your own eyes. And with this new event, this new Anthropocene, you know, we shouldn't really see the Anthropocene, the age of man, as it is more formally known, until, you know, millions of years down the road, but we're seeing it now. This is remarkable in any scale. We are actually seeing our own impact that we know will last millions of years into the future, in a timeline that is like less than a blink of an eye in terms of geological record. You know, what more can you say? We live in a system, right? And if you take the indigenous perspective, this is our one earth, our one mother, the Ishkakamakwe. And I believe my creation story. I believe that this place was chosen by this great mystery or this great spirit, call it God if you will, to come to know itself as the most beautiful being in the whole universe. And if you just take a moment, as I encourage many of the students to often, perhaps even to take an offering out to the forest nearest you, or even a tree on your front lawn, to say thank you, thank you for the breath that you give me, or thank you for the water that I'm reliant on for to be nurtured. One begins to start to embrace this realization that this is the only place that we have. And whereas the colonial mind points to this primitive indigenous past, in fact, the indigenous educated mind today points to a past where we took care of each other, where we took care of the earth, where we recognized our relationship to all other beings, that in fact, I am just one of the beings that was given a right to become part of the consciousness of that most beautiful spirit, of that most mysterious one, coming to know itself and choosing this one place. It is one earth. It's not a separate set of countries. It's not, a separate set of races that, are defined by paternalism. We are one human race. And if you look at all the indigenous peoples, and I used to teach courses on, global indigenous spiritualities, and so I have looked at many, I've spent time with elders of many indigenous groups. Remember, I am an Anishinaabe, I'm just one. And I'm also Irish, which actually kind of gives me two with the Celts or the Druids, which I'm thankful for. There is more similarity amongst the indigenous past in that thinking, that way of life, than there are differences. Honoring the trees, honoring the air. It's not complicated. Right? We can complicate it with this science and show you how, if you drop a bunch of garbage into the water, it's going to eventually make its way back into your drinking system, right? I mean, microplastics are everywhere, literally everywhere, the highest mountain peak to the deepest ocean. This is our choice. This is my choice. Right? I am a part of this. I'm not outside of it, speaking to you as above it all. I am a part of it. And so I have chosen to take action, but I feel emotional in this moment because there are many times when I feel like no matter how much action I take, it's not going to be enough. And I think such is the reason why our communities in the past were so close, right? Why everywhere where you see indigenous communities thriving in the past, you see the earth actually regenerating in such a way that the trees grow taller, right? That the animals are healthier. And how far have we come from that? Well, let's talk about the Neolithic Revolution for a second. Right? Essentially, according to anthropologists, archaeologists, there's this revolutionary period after the last ice age when humans essentially became agriculturalists, and this led, and I don't think there's any disputing this, but this led to a climate change. Now, the way that I like to argue this climate change is that as each of us, our communities, individuals, civilizations evolved, right? Because we weren't just these stagnant people living in caves, kind of like waiting to be found, to be educated, as the historical record might lead you to believe. but we were actually, on a mass scale, a scale that is sort of unimaginable in the colonialist story, right? In the tens of millions, and if I believe what my teachers have told me, the hundreds of millions of people who were here prior to the year 1500, we were evolving with the land. Right? There would have been members of our community whose sole responsibility was to cross-pollinate varieties of seed to produce, new varieties, not only that were acclimatized as they grew, but that produced new food strains. And of course, then we can get into, the hundreds of varieties of corn, beans, squash, many varieties of sunflower and potatoes. This is what Europeans arrived to, and before them, the what are called the Vikings arrived to, and if you believe our stories, what the Chinese arrived to long before, Columbus set sail. And if you believe our stories too, we arrived over there long ago as well. But of course, that history has been mostly erased. There are those who still remember, like some of the teachers that I have, which I feel very fortunate to have been exposed to, because I still would be in this sort of dark age of thought, believing that, my people sort of danced around a fire at night wearing headdresses and carrying spears, and we're singing their next hunt into action. Like, nothing could be further from the truth. And so as our civilizations evolved, we didn't just evolve as people, we evolved as a community of a myriad of ethnobotanics, right? All the different kinds of trees. And as the climate changed, as I've mentioned before in this class, there were people in our communities who were recognizing, who were identifying where there would, where our civilizations could evolve to 150 years down the future. So there's much more predictability in terms of how the climate was changing. It wasn't this sort of dramatic, like we're experiencing now, like just rise in CO2. It was much more subtle. And there's fluctuations, and there's different stories here if you look in the ice core samples, but I'm not going to get too much into that because I really want to focus on the indigenous story, right? The story of the peoples and their growing techniques and how they actually thrived through these, climate events rather than a global climate change. And it's quite extraordinary, right? That story, which I've been telling to the students in this class, is really remarkable. That we as humans on this earth, prior to the rise of what is essentially colonial thought, which extends into religious thought, which extends into, what's that book by Nietzsche? Give me a second. The Genealogy of Morality. I see somebody wrote something. Well, Zainab, there's multiple books he wrote, but essentially the Genealogy of Morality, in which we trace the history of thought. Sorry, I have a message board up here. Okay, so what would it have been like to live at this time? Well, you can imagine that your family was closer, that you relied upon each other, the gifts that you had, that children would be nurtured in their gifts to pursue them. You would be, during certain seasons, spring, summer, and into fall, surrounded by lush fields of fruits and vegetables. You would have trading partners, right? You have elders whose sole responsibility would be to understand the carrying capacity of the community and the surrounding communities, the neighbors. Often those people speaking multiple languages and dialects of a singular language, carrying out the responsibility to dialogue with their neighbors so that the trade relationships that had persisted for literally hundreds of generations continue to thrive. You know, you're talking about people who were so highly organized in their way of life that, you know, everything was coordinated. Even as I've learned more recently, when pregnancies occurred. So, you know, it was during the summer solstice, actually this time, that union, that sacred union between man and woman to produce the child unfolded, you know, in a sacred dance that would have been shared and practiced generation upon generation, so that those you know, beautiful children could be sung into the world with the drum at the spring solstice, right? An epic time where everything begins to grow. And that brings me back, you know, to my introduction to the saying Mishikan Dodem. Dodem is my clan, right? But in that word, D-O-D-E-M, is Ode. And Ode, as I've shared with my students on many occasions, is not the heart, but it's the pump. It's that action that's happening within my chest and yours in this very moment, in which an electric pulse is sending, you know, waves throughout your body of water, or sacred water, or miskwe, or your blood. And we know that water carries memory now. We know that blood carries memory. And so I call on you to seek the message of your own heart, to say, is this crazy? Is these things that I'm bringing up today, should they be part of our immediate conversation and immediate action at every school, in every environment across the world right now? Or will this be, you know, relegated to an afterthought until such time as we are the ones that have to flee? And you see, if you look at the past, what you'll see is that before the 1750 timeline, before the 1600s, let's go back all the way back to 1500 when the first Europeans arrived. You know, let's go back to the time of the conquistadors. You know, some of the most savagely brutal people to ever have lived, in my opinion. You know, taking out entire countries. Well, what we'd call today a country, but to taking out entire peoples in the course of just 20 years. They, in some of their first journeys, or journeys of discovery, as the colonizer likes to call them, you know, reached all the way into the interior of like Georgia. What we see happening, you know, basically immediately after, is the decline of the populations of indigenous people. Now, so significant were these declines that there is no scale in which to compare to today, even if you consider the Holocaust as you know, something to compare to. It pales, and this time pales in comparison to even that devastating encounter with mental illness. These diseases, the story often goes, indigenous people simply had no immunity. The truth is, no one had immunity to these diseases. That's why the Black Death occurred in America, or in Europe, in the 1400s, what we see is this dramatic decline of the European population. And I kind of question why and who survived that and what families were able to persist. And interesting that America suddenly discovered right after coming out of the recovery of that. But that's a story for another day. I want you to think of it this way. This is the part of the story that I want to tell today, is that when Champlain came down the St. Lawrence and the north shore of Lake Erie in Ontario, and seeing these, populations of some of the healthiest people on the planet, what he was seeing was still the remnants of a population decline of around 90%. Okay. So he was coming into southwestern Ontario, and at that time, the censuses that they did estimated the populations to be around 40 to 50,000, perhaps 60,000 Attawandaron people. A people who even the French called the neutrals because of their practices of peace. The peoples whose land that University Waterloo sits upon. Likely in the building of the school, there was remnants of their historical past dug up, but one can only speculate because much of, again, that history has been deliberately and strategically erased. But we know that throughout Kitchener area, there's multiple places where the evidence of these Attawandaron peoples, as the Huron called them, which simply means the people who speak funny, it can be found. Well, if he came in and there had already been a 90% decline in population, then what he was actually witnessing was just a small fraction of what the population used to be, which in my estimates would have been in the hundreds of thousands of people. This is simply based on looking at the land, because the land was an oak savanna. Even in this picture, which I just like because of the depiction of family, although it does still sort of connote this very primitive. You still see the guy in the background with the underwear on and the spear in his hand, right? Which the colonized mind simply cannot get away from. But at least in this one, you see the pumpkin, right? The birch bark baskets, the corn being hammered out and hung, the birch bark canoes being repaired. Of course, each of these things would have happened seasonally, but with the depiction of the maples changing in the background, maples were actually only growing, or they would often be grown on north facing slopes in the region. And that was because that would allow the maple harvest season to last longer. What I find interesting about this picture too is that birch bark basket you see at the bottom of the screen. Just about a month ago, I had the great privilege to go with an archaeologist who found just north of where I am in present-day Sault Ste. Marie, or Bawating, the place of the rapids, in the land of the Obajuanong, or the Batchewana First Nation. Of course, we have Garden River here as well, title signatories to the Robinson-Huron Treaty, with Batchewana also signing the, what's that called? The Pennefather Treaty, in which they were surrounded by I believe the RCMP with at least 100 guns and forced to sign over their land, in which now there's a massive annuities case that is soon to be settled. Yet another lie told to the people about the past. But anyways, that's a whole other story in the annuities case that's going to settle for billions, literally billions of dollars. But there we went up and we did ceremony to honor what was found underneath a rock facing in a very particular direction and a certain slope on the hill, a whole bunch of these birch bark baskets, right? Remnants of, my ancestors who took care of the land, who tapped, thousands of maple trees in the season in order to provide sugar, not only for their communities, but their surrounding neighbors for, 1,000 generations, or at least 100 generations. But so devastating was this decline in population between 1500 and 1600 as a result of the very strategically spread diseases. And of course, again, nobody was immune to them. What happened was we had a global climate event, and that was a decline in the temperature as a result of the following of the around 56 million hectares of land that was being cultivated at the time. So catastrophic was this decline in population and this following of literally millions of hectares of land that our CO2 globally reduced, and as a result, the temperature of the earth. Now, to put this in perspective, if you're still with me, hopefully I'm not losing you guys. I know that sometimes I can go off on these tangents, but it's what's in my heart. So fortunately, I get to be the teacher this time. But if we were to be able to somehow repeat this right now and allow 56 million hectares of land to go fallow, we would only reduce global emissions by about 10%. So that was as a result of millions upon millions of indigenous people dying, which is a scary thought. So this is caused by humans, and there's no doubt about that. And the shift that we must take is to life-supporting infrastructure. Right. One of the students, I forget who it was in this moment, but shared her thesis with me this past week, and it's the design of one of the buildings, nesting for the swallowtail, which is there's certain species that are actually endangered in the region where you guys are currently. And she said at the end of her email, but likely this will never happen because the builders are too worried about the bird shit, sorry for swearing, that will result from having, bird nests built into the infrastructure of a building. And I just thought, how far we have to go, right? That we can simply hire window cleaners or perhaps harvest the bird shit, because it's actually one of the best fertilizers of land. And it just made me think of how our ancestors chose the places where we would build cities, such as Toronto, where we would actually observe the animals first, and we would watch the migratory patterns of massive populations. Just for example, the passenger pigeon, which is now extinct, they would be flying in what has been described to me as populations of billions of birds. So vast were these populations that, as the previous video described, the fish dotting out the sun, the birds, flying over our villages, dropping some of the best fertilizer, would block out the sun in flocks of 1 billion, right, for an entire day. That is the relationship that we once had to the earth. And it truly saddens me that I will never get to experience that in my lifetime. Right? That imagine the songs that would have been sung in the darkness as a flock of 1 billion birds flew over. One simply had to cast a net in order to have a meal that evening. And at that time, the birds lovingly and willingly gave up their lives because we were a part of them, and they knew it as much as we knew it then. So where are we at now? Where will we be in the next 100 years? Okay. No, I don't necessarily trust everything that comes from the World Economic Forum. Personally, I do think that video summarizes the state that we're in, and it just is an emotional experience for me to just see, that we may not have a chance to say to our young, like, I did everything I can. Because perhaps we didn't. So I wanted to remind us of the worldview which was part of the caretaking of the earth. I know I'm realizing I'm like kind of over time here today, and I do appreciate you spending this time with me. If you're still here, if you survive like the last one, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop at 11 for sure, just to give everybody a break. But there was a time before when we followed the moon cycles. I continue to, of course, we're heading towards the strawberry moon now where I live, and it is the rise of the sweet juice of the strawberry. Just one of the harvests that will be maintained, one of the ceremonies that we will do to honor our place on this earth. But this is sort of this cyclical pattern that my ancestors paid very close attention to. There's sun cycles, moon cycles, earth cycles, there's Venus cycles, which isn't included on this, but if you look at the center, there's a cycle of the self as well, right? The gestation cycle of the human, the 260-day sacred cycle. And what I'm asking my students in this class, which I realize very rarely gets asked of them throughout their education, which was very rarely asked of me, is to look inward, right? To say, who am I? And this is not to shame anybody into action. It's simply to ask you, who are you? And what is there to offer your family, your community, your environment? You know, in the past, our education system as Anishinaabe, we nurtured the identity of the self, such that, you know, around the age of 14 years, 12 years, around that age of puberty, right? It's this really important, dramatic change that happens in the human body, and we celebrated it. We celebrated it by sending our young out into the bush without food or water for several days, of course, being closely monitored, so that they could realize what they are, right? That they are the earth. And that if you just go without food and water for a couple of days, no more true does that become when the hunger strikes your belly, right? No more true does that become when you stop worrying about, you know, how your hair looks, and you start to realize and feel the beating heart of the mother, the earth, which I've had the great privilege to experience. And then when the elders come and they sing to you as you cry, you know, in the darkness of that lodge with nothing, you realize just how important that family is, and the community and the environment. Right? As you become as you are visited by the spirits of our relations, which are all. So I'm going to share that much with respect to this complex worldview, and get to sort of what is the action. So the pictures below are 8 weeks ago on the land, and just the reminder that you have agency as an individual, that there's nobody saying to me, you can't do this, Andrew. I'm just, like, I'm saying, please let me grow my seeds. You know, this is my research. And convincing an institution of that sometimes is difficult, because research seems to always have to be something that happens over there, separated from my own identity. But when I plead, you know, with the president and say, please, like, these are the seeds that I've taken responsibility. Their lives are critical that I plant them. Let me have the opportunity, and let's see the education that results. Fortunately, there are some that listen to that, but there are still many. Is my camera off? Sorry, guys. I think it is. Can you guys still see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, but your camera's off, Andrew.
Okay, sorry. I was just the narrator there for a moment. I apologize. But we move on in this course to step 6. And of course, there are 5 steps before this that I'm not going to talk about in this moment. Maybe perhaps you'll want to take the class now to learn about those other steps. But what we shift towards now is recognizing that when we harvest, as in the past, what are some of the things that we would be considering? Well, we'd be considering our own need, but that's not the first need that we would be considering. We'd be considering the need of the environment, right? So the animals, the other beings that we have relationships to and are responsible for first. That's when we plant those seeds. That's the first ones we think about. We think about the seeds themselves, the ones that I'll need to plant in the future. And you can't screw that up. Right? In the past, you can't screw that up. Today, you can just call up Monsanto and order a bunch, right? But in the past, you know, your literal survival depends on you not screwing up. But we had, what's it called? Like systems in place to account for, you know, mistakes. And as the students can attest, I made a big mistake in growing the land here, not only in the design that I had, but in the soil that I brought in. And there was a number of other mistakes. This is a brand new climate that I'm growing in. But the outcomes of a successful harvest, which I am now planning for, it was a time to celebrate, right? Where I'm looking now to the celebration of the fall equinox, when I get to pull that corn, hopefully, off the cobs or off the stalks, that I've been singing to, and get to peel away that medicine that is surrounding it, and say, miigwech, my relative, thank you for growing yet again. But we had to, for a successful harvest, you have all these considerations to take into account, like the environment, climate, inclement weather, community need, not just your community, but your surrounding community, the need of the trading partners, which comes into play in step 7. But there are many harvests. So unlike sort of today, where you see the combines come into the fields, and as I mentioned last class, the corn, that sacred being in which my ancestors raised and nurtured in all the varieties as specialists in the cross-pollination of seeds. Today, the corn is not even touched by hands until it's, consumed in, like, let's say, a chocolate bar or something, which, by the way, is delicious, because colonialism is delicious. Let's not forget that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be persisting as much as it is now. And that comes from Vanessa Andrade, who talks about that in much more detail. Okay. But the harvest time brings together community, and that's why I encourage institutes to grow, to have a space on their own land where they can grow and harvest, so that they can bring together people of all walks of life, because food is what really brings us together. Our preparing, preserving, and storing techniques varied widely depending on climate, depending on the people, depending on the stories that they told, depending on the harvest. But each technique, facilitated the thriving of the peoples in their selected environments, or the environments that selected them. So this picture, it was taken this morning. It's hard to tell here. I'm just going to exit the shared screen for a second. I think you can still see, just zoom in a little bit, but you can see here the what are these called? Sunflowers growing. There's a squash in there. In these beds here is corn. It's kind of hard to see. There's corn throughout too, and tobacco. So we have sunflower, corn, tobacco, and then in these trellises, you can kind of see the beans growing. So I'm really happy to announce that, yes, this space is growing to my students, because there was a moment there where I didn't think I'd have a season because of all the mistakes that I made. And I just want to talk about that, those mistakes, because we all are going to make mistakes, especially when we're doing something for the very first time, but expect that. And if you can expect that, then you can lead to, sustainable practices. And here's just another example of what I'm doing on my own front lawn. In creating these beds for medicine, which you could see this was in just a couple of weeks of living in my home, but we have changed the stone to a walkway. In here is a number of medicines growing, and blueberries along the front here. We're building a retaining wall now because I don't want to lose any more soil. These beds are done up here now, which can be planted, probably not this season, but the next. My neighbors, they thought I was crazy in the beginning when I started digging up my lawn. But now I think there's some appreciation for what's happening on my property, to show people as an example that I have agency. To my students, I have agency. I can do something. I can take action, and I'm not restricted by anyone other than the messages of my heart, right? So I'll leave you with that much. I realize I've gone like a really long time. If you have made it through to this time, I do want to offer up a chance for questions.